I'm very grateful to Leanne for stepping in at reasonably short notice to come along today, talk about something she knows very well. Leanne is working with myself and Anthony Ware on a ARC linkage project. The linkage partner, the industry partner, is Plan International. So this started with work we did, and Leanne did a pilot project with the Australian office of Plan International. We initially did work with Indonesia and Myanmar and the Philippines. Myanmar is not an area we can go and work at the moment. So in our ARC project, we're working in Indonesia, the Philippines, Kenya and Mozambique. And earlier this year, we did some field work in Indonesia. This relates to a program that comes out of that field work from a civil society organization called the Wahid Foundation. It runs a very innovative program called the Peace Village program. I'll let Leanne talk about it more. And because Leanne has done some other things from former lives, a expert in evaluation, she wrote up an evaluation report of this program. So I should say that the linkage looks at opportunities and need for crossover between the humanitarian development space and responding to violent extremism space, two worlds that have historically not talked to each other or felt uncomfortable with each other. And we're not suggesting a securitizing approach, but we are saying the sort of things that development CSOs often do are the sort of things that can reduce levels of vulnerability to violent extremism. And the Peace Village program is something that does that. Not for me.
Okay, cool. I will throw back to you quite a lot though,
sure.
Greg,
Yep.
Especially at the beginning when I'm talking more about the contextual side of things that Greg knows really well, being kind of Indonesian. So,
Which is my stomach part.
Yeah. Yeah, so as Greg mentioned, this is like the evaluation that we did of the Wahid Foundation's Peace Villages program. And part of the reason for that was we were going to collect data from them for the rest of our ARC linkage project, and we thought a way to give back to that organisation was to do this evaluation for them as like a free contribution to say thanks for them setting up the logistics and organising the focus groups for us and generally welcoming us and showing us around what they were doing, which was really amazing. So it was good to be able to give them something back. I'll just throw to Greg to give an overview of violent extremism in Indonesia and the reason why we went to, so the next slide just talks about why we went to these specific areas, because there's a heightened risk of extremism.
Yeah, so Indonesia, it's the world's most populous Muslim nation. So the population of Indonesia is touching on 285 million people, and probably 85% identify as Muslim. It's also I think, far and away the most successful democracy across the Muslim world. Not a perfect democracy. It transitioned in May '98 when Suharto stepped down, so I've been backed by the military. Imperfect development, but steady progress. The first democratic president, Abdurrahman Wahid, came into office in October 1999, but immediately in 2000 there was a series of unrest in Ambon and later on in Sulawesi. And at the time, it wasn't clear what groups, if any groups, were behind this. Strangely, for a place that's big on conspiracy theory, people didn't spot the actual conspiracy that was happening. But in October 2002, you'll recall there was a series of bombings in Bali, which killed 202 people, including 88 Australians. And suddenly Indonesia realized it had a problem, like the problem with Al-Qaeda. In fact, it was a group affiliated with Al-Qaeda. Cooperation with Australian Federal Police and Indonesian police led to tracking down the bombing network, and then it became clear this was indigenous. And that was quite shocking because people were more comfortable believing it was some sort of military political game or something else going on, as opposed to a homegrown extremist network. So you can imagine the last 20-odd years, there's been a lot of work done on violent extremism. Indonesia had a series of bombings through the 2000s, and then that by 2009, when the second bombing in the JW Marriott, that was the last major incident with violence because the police finally got on top of the problem. And so when we went to speak to people a few years ago about their perceptions of violent extremism, they said the police are handling it, not a problem, but we are concerned about rising sectarianism. And so we devised the term hateful extremism. We said, let's talk about violent and hateful extremism, because we know that where people are engaged in acts of hate speech, incitement to hatred, it may lead to violence, but even though it doesn't, it's still a problem in itself. And that's a broader spectrum to consider. So our project's been built around that framing, and a project that actually fits really nicely with our interest is this Peace Village program, which now operates across dozens of local government areas, mostly in Java, but some outside Java. And what the Wahid Foundation Peace Villages are doing are the sort of things that development agencies would normally do: community development, so microfinance, empowering women, protecting children, encouraging education, now increasingly concerned about the environment and responding to climate change. So what's this got to do with violent extremism? Well, the Peace Villages were set up in areas where there was a historic problem with recruitment and where there are historic issues of tension. I said if we try and step into those areas, perhaps we can make a difference.
Yep. So these were some of the villages that we went to around these areas, so in Ms. Novolovic's chapter, she talked about why they've set up the Peace Village in this area, because of them being an area with terrorist networks and rising conservatism as well. And so just as Greg was saying, so the Peace Villages are mostly in Java and started in 2017 in partnership with UN Women. They have tried to address like the key drivers towards extremism for women, and they class that as three things kind of around women being bored or having like unfulfilling lives in some way. Also social connection, where they're drawn into extremist networks because of maybe a husband who's been pulled into it or different family members who are pulled into it. And then economic need, where they might get money for being part of terrorist organisations. So they've like built the program to address each of those things through building tolerance, conflict resolution skills, gender equity, and a lot of women's empowerment program, particularly around entrepreneurship, and improving businesses that a lot of them were already running, just making them much better by helping them with hygiene, labelling, marketing, all of these different aspects of business that's helped them increase their ability to be successful business people. They also have a very strong participatory way of working, where they get the community members to run the program for themselves, which I'll talk about a little bit more, as some of the key things that has helped with sustainability. So a real focus is strengthening community resilience against push and pull factors through all these different ways of working through, I don't think I talk about on that side. Oh yeah, so through trainings that they run. So at the very beginning, they go and tell villagers what it is that they do, and the village then either agrees or doesn't agree to participate. If they do, then it would go towards, how does it work? They do some type of like a declaration, a village declaration, and the head agrees, and it's written into their village regulations.
Yeah, so Indonesia has different levels of government, as you can imagine, a bit like Australia, but at the local government level, village, if it's rural, it's a different term used for a peri-urban setting, but you know, it's a community of 5,000-10,000 people, and so there is a recognition that if you don't have buy-in from whoever's village head, or Lura is the other name, then you're not going to have much success. So to try and build that confidence first, sign an agreement saying yes, we're happy to do these things, and then
and that gives them like some accountability and a top-down sort of support when they're doing this other work, which is mostly from the bottom up. So then they're working to build community leaders as well, who are mostly women, and then setting up all these different trainings and support groups and things like the POCJA, the working groups. And then they do a lot of awareness raising as well around violent extremism and gender-based violence and things that they pull into it, and work on different community-led initiatives, whatever it is that the community thinks is the most pressing needs in their village. So they were quite varied between the different villages that we went to in terms of what they were actually doing. But these are kind of like the key things that were the same in each. Do you want to add anything?
Well, just that image there is a entrance gateway, which seems innocuous, but it's sort of a bureaucratic element here. It's sort of welcome to this village, and they've actually called it a peace village, sort of they've branded it that way. But the RT02/04 on the right-hand pillar refers to a sort of like a neighbourhood watch district. Sounds very much like a lot of surveillance. That's not really, but if you want privacy, perhaps don't go to Indonesian villages. It's friendly, but it's bureaucratically broken down into these little well-defined communities. It's one reason why they can go to elections next February 14 with 200 million voters and vote for several tiers of government and the president all in one day successfully, because it's all broken down at this sort of granular level. And that means these programs work well if you go with the grain of the bureaucratic system.
And all the way down this path, there's all murals to do with building peace as well, which was quite beautiful. And that's the entry just down to one of the peace villages that we visited. That was the first one. Yeah. So with the evaluation itself, we did the fieldwork in January and February this year and went to 10 of the different peace villages across Java and talked to 159 people. So the vast majority of them were in focus groups. So we did 14 focus groups. And those were the ones, the data that I used was from my focus groups, Anthony Ware's focus groups, and Simi Barton's focus groups. And I did all interviews, so the 8 interviews. And they were all, so we segregated genders. Oh no, we didn't always. Sometimes we did. Yeah, I don't think there's really much more to say about that.
People are friendly and happy to talk about what they're doing, so
yeah,
it makes it a pleasant field.
It's great.
Yeah.
And these are the areas where we went to. So the big dots are just the main cities, and then the smaller dots are all the villages that we went to. So they were all in surrounding areas. They look really close to the main cities, but some of them took quite a long time to get to.
And next week you're going off back to Central Java and you'll go to East Java.
That's sticking out a bit at the top, isn't it?
No, that's the island of Madura, but sort of underneath that island is where you'll be going.
Ah, cool. You can tell I've looked at the map well. Yeah, and that's the thing, like we're going back there. I'll be back there next Wednesday and talking to a lot of looking at different villages and kind of doing a bit more of a deep dive into some extra questions that came up throughout the evaluation. So there might be kind of a part 2 evaluation that probably frames it a bit differently, because with all of this data, I analysed it using grounded theory, but now I'm going to be developing a framework and do more of an analysis against that framework. So I'll go and ask questions against that framework as well. And
we partnered with the University of Indonesia. So Titan, who's been visiting here down the end of that photograph, actually very kindly brought her son and daughter along to help with interpretation and colleagues. And that's important because Indonesia naturally is a little bit hesitant about outside researchers coming in and just waltzing around. Partnering with a local university is a much more natural helpful way of doing it. Yeah, and they made us all visiting scholars, which is nice. Yes, so you're off to see them next week. Yeah, so we're working quite a lot with the University of Indonesia pretty closely. They'll come around with us the whole time that we're there again, which they did on this first trip as well. So the key themes that came out were women's empowerment, power and inclusion, receptiveness to the Peace Village ideas, peace and violence, and sustainability. And so instead of where I might have usually mapped the key themes to their theory of change or whatever sort of monitoring evaluation framework they have set up, I didn't in this case because they had so many different bits and pieces all over the place. It wasn't really clear what they have a lot of theory of changes and a lot of lists of different indicators that don't all match up. So I thought rather than trying to wade my way through all that, I would have needed to collaborate with them a lot more to do something like that. So I just did this more sort of grounded look at what data came through, which worked quite well and actually aligned with their theory of changes as well. So with the women's empowerment, there was really strong feedback from all of the villages around this, with all of the women saying that they felt a lot more confident, a lot more knowledgeable in their businesses, in things around gender-based violence and awareness of violent extremism. Their businesses and incomes had all improved, which was useful for not just themselves and making them feel better about themselves, but it also helped their families, and they were able to give kind of objective things that have helped, like they've been able to fix their houses or send their children to school
and things like that have been big positives for them. There'd been a really big increase in the number of female leaders in each of the villages, which was good to see. And there was a lot of evidence of skill sharing and knowledge sharing where they were influencing other people because they felt a lot more confident in their knowledge, and they felt so confident that they felt willing to share it with other people, and they really wanted to share it with other people. So there's quite a lot of evidence of them setting up little groups to share skills and, you know, teaching their friends things and pulling friends into the different groups as well. There was also positive impacts that they were able to identify on the broader community, such as there being better local products available of higher quality, and that the whole village was having increased wealth because they put little bits of their money back into a fund for community use as well.
And most of those products are food, which is a big thing in Indonesia, also handicraft. But food, Indonesians are particularly fond of snacks. Who isn't fond of snacks?
Yeah,
so
and that's some
crispy,
of them.
crunchy things that you get. And that lends itself to micro-enterprise quite well.
Yeah.
But coordinating means you can sell easy and you can maintain set hygiene standards and other things you'll be in charge of packaging and so on.
Yeah, and like one example, I think I was telling you the other day, that the one lady who was saying that she used to sell juice, that she'd just she'd juice it at home, put it in a jug and go around the village with a cup and give you some and then give you some out of the same cup. And so after the training, she learned how to make it more hygienically and with preservatives and different things, different ways of making it better. And then, like I said, the labelling and all of the other things as well. But this was the photograph. It was like a big exhibition type day where they had a table for each village and they were displaying some of their products. And they're really great products. I bought a lot. I've eaten them all now.
Yeah.
So it's just a quote from one of the women who said that now she's really championing women's rights and equality. She's realised she's a feminist. She's learned about her rights and that we have a say. And this was actually a really long quote. But yeah, really positive stuff like this was very commonly said across all of the villages. So power and inclusion, they were able to recognise that there'd been reduced power monopolies and increased inclusivity. Definitely strengthened social connection was a huge thing to come out, and that there's been much more collaboration between stakeholders at all different levels. So between community members and their local governance, between different local government structures, and between organisations as well. So much stronger links all around. So there was a lot of places where there was more room for inclusion of marginalised people, particularly LGBTIQIA plus people, where they were really not willing to speak about them at all. There was very little evidence of inclusion of people with disabilities as well, and a few other things that were, I think I talk about them a bit later on, but things like they have this, the working groups, where I was trying to figure out who was getting to be in these leadership positions within the working groups as well, and if they changed them over. And it seems that they don't, and maybe that's the higher level community elites who are in those groups, and maybe there'd be room to bring some more marginalised people into those groups and also change over the leadership roles at times to give other people a turn. But yeah, so there's a little bit more work to do on that part, I think. But they are chipping away at the whole thing. So it's still a patriarchal society, but they're chipping away at it. So they're doing some good inroads into that with a lot more female leadership and a lot more respect, I think, given to local women because of what they've been able to achieve as well.
And all of these communities are diverse. It's a Muslim majority country, but there are different Muslim communities. But there's invariably Catholic and Protestant Christian and sometimes Buddhist and Hindu and other communities. And often there's tangible improvement in sort of relations across those communities and greater involvement across, which is good.
Definitely, it seemed like they were quite good at including minority ethnic groups in particular. I did think that they could bring, I think I'll talk about this a bit later as well, but maybe they could bring men a little bit more into some of the conversations as well in a way that would be quite useful, like especially around the gender-based violence conversations. So
yeah, I think it's an area to follow up because in some areas are more advanced. The gender-based violence has emerged very much organically as a real need. And one of the areas, surprisingly, that has developed is empowering women with knowledge of their legal rights and avenues for recourse. So
that's been really useful for them. Yeah, and so this is just another person talking about the breakdown in patriarchal values, so that there's a gradual shift in unequal power relationships, particularly between the male elites in the village and female community members in particular. And there's Yanni Wahid. So I was interested in the receptiveness to Peace Village ideas, just in terms of particularly how men in the community saw this, because it is a women-led initiative. So I was interested in how many women in the community might not be able to be involved in it because their husbands wouldn't let them, which is a really difficult thing to try and find out, obviously. And the people who we were talking to were people who were involved in the program. So obviously their husbands had let them go. So it was a different group of people who we were talking to, and I was only really able to pretty hardly explore that at all because, they didn't really know. But a lot of them said that it was working really well and that there only had been minor backlash against the gender-based violence conversations and women's leadership type stuff. So there was one in particular where they were having problems with their village head trying to convince, it took quite a long time to convince the upper levels of people that it was going to be a good thing to do. Most of them said that their husbands were not too bad, they at least tolerated it. And some of them said that their husbands were happy about it because now they were earning more money. So that was good. They do this thing that they called the mosquito coil intervention, which I thought was quite clever. And I know that we've done things like this in Melbourne as well, but where rather than going in and saying, we're going to teach you about tolerance and peace and gender-based violence and all these kind of more tricky things, they come in saying, we're going to help you with economic empowerment, leadership, education, and we can do like soft entry things like cooking classes and things like that, and then bring in the tolerance and peace type conversations later on, which seem to work really well for them. Yeah. And like we said before, like formalising it in the village regulations and decree was really helpful, because then the community feels like they're allowed to be part of it because the higher level village head has said it's okay. So it's kind of giving them permission for that. And again, LGBTQIA+ was too hard and also seen as being kind of a Western or liberal agenda that was being pushed. So some area for more work. Now, this is one of the female leaders in one of the villages who said, my husband has no comment about her participation. He doesn't block it, but he doesn't encourage it. So it was like a kind of similar thing that a lot of people said. There was quite a lot of work on peace and violence in terms of they've been able to set up all these different security teams, early warning task forces, and different recourses where people know now where to go. So they've got increased knowledge about when they see something, how they should respond to that, which has given them increased self-efficacy. Also, the building stronger social connection has helped in terms of they feel more responsibility for their fellow villagers as well. So they were saying, like, if they see something, they feel more like it is actually their responsibility, not just to turn a blind eye to it. And the Guster values were really, so Panchasila was a really important part of the way that they underpin their teaching. And maybe you could talk a bit more about Guster values or something.
Sure, yeah. Guster refers to as a contraction for Abdurrahman Wahid. He was president from 1999 to 2001, and it's where the Wahid Foundation was set up after his presidency. But it's basically progressive pro-social values. He was always very big on respect for minorities and arguing that Islam actually understood correctly, supported democracy and supported a positive engagement with diversity, but didn't problematize it. But yeah, this of tolerance or more than tolerance, respect, and taking pleasure in diversity and appreciating it has been a big thing.
Yeah, and I really love this ball at the Perception
Because
I just think it's cool with motorbikes.
okay,
And I like the colour of it.
that is a very personal thing.
Yes,
Yep.
I like that photo.
I like this photograph because it's got food.
Yeah.
Has my vote.
Yeah. That was a pretty amazing spread that they put on for us. So
Yeah.
that was really good. That was one of Sumi's focus groups.
Yeah.
And so this is one of the women actually at this focus group saying that they learned how to resolve conflict better and to focus on building peace and harmony between people in her community and how she should respond to problems. So that was a huge thing, is like what they should do when there is a problem. Now they know we go to this place and do this and this. So having those teams set up was seen as a really, really helpful thing. So another key theme was around sustainability, which people talked about a lot, because with some of the villages that we went to, the Wahid Foundation was no longer in those villages, and they'd been able to sustain the work that they were doing in a way that seemed like it was very sustainable. Like I got the feeling that it had become embedded into that community and they were going to continue rolling with it because they had these community-based leaders. They were constantly sharing their skills and like building up other people in the community to take on leadership type roles and to run their own community-led initiatives. Like if somebody had an idea, it seemed like it was always encouraged and pushed forward as well, which was really cool. And again, having those systems and task forces with clear mandates set up and encouraged by the leadership, like the village leadership level, seemed very helpful and in a way that it was going to continue going. And with the training and resources, how it's all process oriented, it's all very practical. People know how to use it. They know how to then train other people to use it as well. Yeah. Yeah, and so people were motivated to keep going as well, and they're really proud of what they've achieved and feel grateful to be able to do it to ourselves, which I think that is like an amazing quote. In terms of it is community led, and that really shows that Wahid Foundation has been doing a really great job in being bottom up and supporting communities to do things for themselves. Like it's pretty inspiring, I think.
Yeah, and these are quotes that came out without any prompting. It's not people sort of regurgitating standard lines. These are their own way of expressing it. Yeah,
and us as externals, like we're not Wahid Foundation. They don't have to tell us this stuff. So just a little bit about the analysis framework. I was going to talk about each of these themes, but I don't think I will. I used John Richardson's resilience framework from the disaster space because I like how he sets it up with knowledge, security, connection and wellbeing, and it fitted really well with Wahid Foundation's focus on these 4 things in particular. So I was just able to show how the peace villages have successfully increased each of these things in the community, where John would say, if you increase these 4 things, then you're building community resilience. So it was quite a good, clear way of being able to demonstrate that. Some of the key recommendations we had, so I've talked about a few of them already, but this improved understanding of diversity as not just being about ethnic and religious diversity, but it's actually includes a lot of other people as well, and having a look at their practices of inclusion. So I think that they could really reflect on some of the things that they're doing and see, is this really completely inclusive, or is there ways that we could improve it further, because there is a bit of room for improvement in that. I thought that they should enhance their gender-based violence literacy, because there was like several things that came up that were a little bit concerning, like saying, I can't remember what they said, but it was something to do with like, if you just do what your husband wants, then he's not going to hit you, which is a bit mad. And there were some things around where they were telling people that they should leave violent relationships, but then there was nothing set up for them. So there's no safe houses available. So it's like, yeah, you can tell them to leave, but if you don't have the things in place that can look after them, then that's quite difficult. So there's like several things around that. I think, and I was thinking that it would be good for them to work maybe more with specialist family violence providers in the area as well. A lot of people brought up other sort of side issues that were of concern to them in their community that Wahid Foundation might want to look at as well. Like, people are quite worried about the elections and the type of divisive type misinformation. And so, yeah, being able to figure out what's trustworthy information and what isn't, and Wahid Foundation already does do some stuff around that, but maybe they could do a bit more. And they were talking about how to protect people like whistleblowers, as in people who speak out against things that they see. How can those people feel confident that they're going to be protected and their report will be confidential and things like that? So yeah, we were also thinking it would be good to expand resourcing, because a lot of the villages that they work in are quite close to main centres. So we were wondering about like the need in more remote villages that they haven't ventured into. Like, it would be good, because it's quite an amazing program actually. I really thought it has a lot of benefits that would be great to expand it more across different countries too. I think, not that Wahid Foundation would do that, but yeah, there's a lot of good things that they're doing that we can learn a lot from. Oh, and these are part of the murals after that peace gate when you go down. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I just let, we sort of, Anthony and I were in Kenya recently, and although it's a very different context, actually, there's many surprisingly common elements. I think some of these programs would map across quite nicely. So we'll certainly make that information available. So
yeah.
It's a local interest.
Yeah, so overall it was really excellent, and that's it really. What else?
No, we've covered a lot, so we should perhaps have enough for some questions.
Yeah, the report's huge and it's got so much detail, so I couldn't really go over it all in this, but yeah, there's a lot of meat in it too. It's not really waffly. There was like so much stuff going on and so much really interesting feedback. That's why I wanted to go back and talk to the different participants and people who haven't been participating in the Peace Village program as well, just to delve into it in more details. So, yes, Sharon.
Sounds like you had a lot of good time over there with that spread, lunch and dinner and festivities. Fantastic.
Yeah, it was all eating.
Thanks for sharing. Thank you for sharing, Leanne. Really exciting presentation and huge project, very impactful, I think. So I have a question regarding, if just going back to the original idea of these peace villages being implemented in locations where there were cases of extremism recruitment. So can we go back to that point and see if these initiatives have made a difference in the recruitment drive in these regions? Can you reflect on that?
That's probably, would that be you? Or?
Sure.
At the macro level, it's a bit hard, isn't it?
Yeah, I should have explained that apart from that violence that occurred through the 2000s, when the Islamic State Caliphate emerged, it turned out that probably 1,500 Indonesians had gone off to join the Caliphate. Many would have described themselves as supporting the Caliphate as a utopian project rather than being foreign fighters. But that's a pretty significant, it's percentage-wise small compared with places like Tunisia or something, but it's still meant that many communities knew people who had gone off to Syria. Many of them didn't come home. There's been some repatriations, which is another interesting thing. We did some work on that as well. But some of these locations were chosen because they have high rates of recruitment. Mm-hmm. And recruitment, things like this, tends to be very lumpy. So you have some local charismatic leaders who outperform in that space. Then you have a lot of people from that village going. It very much follows social networks. So it's still early, I think, to figure out what something as indirect as this program does when it comes to recruitment, because we can't sort of run the counterfactual. We don't know who hasn't been recruited. But I think what we are seeing is sort of more openness in these communities to speak up about concerns where there's extremist teaching and more recourse and perhaps more readiness to step in when individuals are at risk or they see something going on that's untoward. When this Peace Village program was first being developed 7-8 years ago, I was a little bit concerned that it was too diffuse and indirect to be really efficient. But I think I've changed my mind. I realize actually this is probably the best way to work for sustainable programs. And if you just go directly to the issue, you probably won't have as much community buy-in, and it actually won't be as successful in the long run. So there's a lot of things happening here which seem to be nice but not consequential. So women's sort of food businesses with microfinance, that's good, but what's that to do with violent extremism? Well, it turns out it's part of an organic whole. I think our understanding now that what has been called countering or preventing violent extremism works best when it changes the ecosystem of the community that's engaged with. It's not just about narrowly targeting recruitment or radicalization or something.
And they did say that there'd been shifts in like people's thinking around hateful extremism and things like that. So like more tolerant villages. I mean, and it's hard to say because of how things change over history. Like there might have been a lot more recruitment, at that certain time in the past, and now there'd be less. So you can't really measure it in terms of, there'd been less people recruited. But I think the fact that they're more tolerant and they seem happier, which hopefully that makes a difference.
Yeah, more confident, active. One village we went to was in Solo, in central Java, surrounding the area where Abu Bakr Bashir, the founder of Jamaat Islami, the terrorist group, has his large religious school. He's actually now out of prison and staying there, keeping quiet. But we spoke to women who live in that surrounding neighbourhood and talked about what had changed. And what was striking was how much more confident they felt about pushing back against extremist influences in their community. And they were right next to us.
Huge, really. That's the one, the Bali bombing one.
That's right, yeah.
I'm just kind of following from that. I mean, these kind of programs don't happen in a vacuum, obviously, and there's like a lot of different programs on all sorts of different issues. So were you able to get a sense of like the development landscape in the different places you've been in and what other programs were going on or had gone on? Because I know like causality is all like really, really difficult here, but do you know?
I don't know that. Is there other NGOs operating in these villages? I wasn't aware of any.
Not those specific villages, but sort of in central Java or the peri-urban area of Jakarta, yes, there are other.
Yeah, of course. But in terms of in these villages, they seemed like they weren't really involved with anything else.
With any other programs?
No, and when I was talking to them as well, we were specifically talking about their involvement in the Peace Village program itself. So we were able to kind of filter out other influences quite well because they knew what it was that the Wahid Foundation was delivering. Like they knew which trainings and which things, which was really quite useful because that's not always the case, especially when, if there's a lot of organisations operating in a place. I know that we have this as a problem at Red Cross where people can't remember if it was Red Cross or was it the CFA or was it like who was it who delivered that program. So when you're trying to evaluate it, it can be hard to like weed out like, oh no, that wasn't us. Yeah, so but people were able to quite clearly say what contribution Wahid Foundation has made.
What the Wahid Foundation, these villages are doing, it's the sort of things that are done in Indonesia anyway. So lots of people are concerned about micro-enterprise because there are a lot of micro-enterprises. They're almost entirely women-led. And a bit of intervention can make a difference to the efficiency. So they can go from, barely surviving to actually being a thriving business for the family. That's often connected with empowerment of women for obvious reasons. Gender-based violence comes up in that conversation. So they're not pushing against the grain, doing something entirely innovative. They're doing stuff that is sort of familiar, but they're doing it in a way that, for these areas that hadn't been done on this scale.
Yeah, and that was the thing. Like we were maybe wanting them to push a bit harder than they're ready for as well. Like, with the inclusivity thing, they just seem like they're really not ready for that. And also we might want them to make like stronger stands against patriarchal type of structures that they're not ready for as well. So, but you can see that they're like just chipping towards it in a way that, at a speed that is suiting them in the community. So, but I think still keeping that agenda
Mark?
is good.
I was interested in your slide on sustainability, which is very encouraging. What do you have in place? So in 5 years' time, is this going to be embedded both within the Wahid Foundation, and is it going to expand, or is it just where you've gone already? Is it going to just be sustained as it is, or is it now something that's just going to keep growing?
Yeah. They're expanding all the time, so they're always like getting new villagers involved, and then they're moving out of older villages who are ready to keep going by themselves. So it's like that's their model, is to come in and help them set it up and get it established under the knowing that they're going to be moving out. So like the community knows that they're not going to be there forever, and it's something that they'll have to maintain themselves, which I think is like a really healthy way to do it, really clearly saying we're not here to save you.
Is there a kind of a plan, or is it necessary, in a few years' time to kind of go back and see if people need things to be kind of refreshed or supported, or
yeah, they seem to go back to the villages, like how they even linked us to villages that they were no longer working in. So do you know much more about how they do that?
It hasn't been going long enough to see how fully how it's worked out, Mark, but it does seem like they've hit on a good pattern where, as Leanne said, they're not necessarily promising to be run indefinitely, but they precipitate something which then is self-sustaining. And they get lots of invitations from other areas saying, could you come do something in our area? And one thing that's also too early to evaluate yet, but there seems to be some impact on changing attitudes with local government leadership and so on, that people want to imitate this and do this. So it hopefully will have a contagion effect.
Yeah, which it seems to be having, like people hear about what's happening in other villages, especially surrounding villages, and say like we want that as well. And
yeah, one thing they have achieved, which is interesting, I mean, it's one metric, it's not the whole metric, but is they've had a number of sites where the president has visited. It's pretty hard to go to the president's office and get time in his schedule to come and visit your local development program. But when he visits and he says this is a good thing and Indonesians should be proud, that just helps open up the space elsewhere.
Yeah, and you could tell they're pretty proud of what they've managed to achieve. Like a lot of them talked about how proud they are.
Vanessa, so.
I was just going to ask about the level of transparency in terms of, I don't want to say the underlying agenda of, peace and anti-CVE or CVE kind of. I mean, if you set up something as an economic empowerment initiative and then suddenly people are, learning about peace and CVE, I'm just wondering, what kind of response or how that process would work, and do people not feel kind of resistant that they've signed up for something and they're getting something else?
Yeah, that's a really important question. From what I saw, it seemed like it was actually very open in terms of what they were talking about. Like they talk about violent extremism quite a lot, and like the Gusto values around like unity and things like this, and harmony, and so it seemed very clear to me. And I'm guessing like at the village level, when they get the village head on board, that they talk quite openly about what the whole thing's about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, Vanessa, that if with CVE, if you're dishonest about what you're doing and sort of do it by stealth, that can rebound on you.
Yeah, it's ethically very questionable.
So they're not doing that. They're not in their face, and they use language which is owned broadly. So the state philosophy of Pancasila, of non-sectarian approach to seeing a place for religion in the public square. That's whatever is owned publicly. So talking about that in a positive way rather than criticising particular groups and being too aggressive in that sort of critique seems like it's a good balance. So they're not pretending, or they're not coming in under false pretenses. They say we want to talk about these things, but they also engage with people's local needs. They don't say we can't talk to you about economic matters because we're here to talk about religious matters. They sort of do it holistically, which seems to work pretty well. I think it's one reason why it looks like a more sustainable approach.
Yeah, maybe a huge thing about that as well is that everybody is local, like all the Wahid Foundation staff are all local, so it's their issues as well. Like with violent extremism in their country or their island and community. They don't want that as well. So rather than being outsiders coming in and telling them we're going to fix you. Yeah. Shadi? Ella?
How did you see age in the process? Because I do know Indonesia is a bit of like, there's a bit of ageism in terms of a lot of respect to the elders, and this sometimes may or may not block the engagement or participation of younger women from these villages. The second question is have you had any sort of information or any suspicions on corruption, especially when the foundation leaves, or have they thought of any mechanism to avoid corruption? Because what I understood is they are supposed to put some investments back from their sales or from their business to be able to sustainably run this instead of constantly getting microfinances. So if you have any data on how that would be managed, or if there are any principles for it.
Yep. So on age, there's quite a strong focus on including younger people as well. And all of Anthony's focus groups for this, he only talked to youth. So mine was talking to people in general, and Sumi was talking to women entrepreneurs. So I think that they've done very well at including younger people, and there was a good mix of people who we talked to as well. And a lot of the leaders are young women too, who are out, sharing skills, influencing people in their communities, bringing people together. So yeah, that was really good. In terms of corruption, I saw no evidence of that, or didn't hear anything about that. So from what I heard, everybody was it seemed like it was handled quite well. Do you know anything else?
Yeah, the question about accountability mechanisms, I mean, there's an informal, because a process where you've engaged so many people that it's very hard for somebody to do something dodgy and not be known about it.
I feel like they'd be really shunned as well, exactly, because they are really proud of what they've managed to achieve, and it's community led, so the whole community has kind of oversight over it, not just like one person who's holding a pot of money. Yeah, but I didn't ask that question specifically. Maybe I can ask them that when I'm back. And that's another thing. It would be great if you guys can think of anything that I should ask them when I'm back there, because we'll be back on Wednesday asking them more stuff. So, Paula?
Oh yeah, thanks for sharing the evaluation. I found it really interesting. I think I'm really curious about whether you encountered kind of different understandings of peace and conflict, either within the villages or across the villages, and like how much kind of autonomy in terms of community-led practices do they have around defining those concepts of peace, conflict, or inclusivity? As you mentioned, there was some dissonance around inclusivity.
They have a lot of freedom around that, and we saw it being shown in all different ways that I was surprised about. So when I was thinking about peace and conflict, the way that I was thinking about it was different than what they were talking about in some ways. So they were talking about peace and conflict. A lot of them talked about school bullying and gangs in the community, and then within the home, within the domestic sphere, between entrepreneurs. So some female entrepreneurs were saying that sometimes they have these fights and things, and so they're using their new mediation skills to try and sort out that, battling over the right spot to have your stool or whatever it is. And then the larger scale, intercommunal disagreements and things like that. So it was at all different levels. Yeah,
that's interesting.
And they also had a lot of freedom in terms of what they were going to be looking at as well. So with their community-led initiatives, they could focus on different things depending on what the community was interested in. And I think that's how the gender-based violence work started to happen, wasn't it? It was that was the community-driven thing, and now they've put it more across all of the villages. But that came out as something that was really important that the women saw was happening a lot, that they wanted to focus on, not just this more, with the violent extremism stuff maybe happening a little bit outside of their purview, where gender-based violence is kind of right in their face.
Yep.
Just building on this, thank you for the presentation. How does religion and other social issues play out in the case, for example?
That was
supportive or
I think when they were talking about like tolerance and inclusion, it seemed to be mostly around that. So that's like really where the focus is, you know, building tolerance and acceptance for different religions and different ethnic groups. So they talked a lot about interfaith dialogue and being friends with people from the different communities. And at a lot of the focus groups, there was different people there, like some Christians and the Chinese ones. I can't remember if they were Buddhist or not, but some, yeah, inclusion of different people. So they said like they'd really opened up their views, and they were talking about how in the past if they'd said something like Merry Christmas, they'd be shunned by their fellow community members, and they've been like trying to work on that not happening and it being more inclusive, that they can, you know, celebrate other people's religions and things as well, and yeah, celebrating diversity rather than just seeing it as an outside thing.
It is a very religious context, and Wahid Foundation is associated with this traditionalist organisation, Nadul Ulama, which probably has 60-70 million affiliates. It would be the largest Islamic civil society group of its kind in the world.
It's huge.
It's rural and it's as the name says traditional, but it's an approach that's seen a lot of innovation in religious schools, madrasa. So there's a secular curriculum component which is very strong and well developed, and so in that sense they're actually quite progressive and certainly pro democracy, human rights issues. So that gives a good backdrop. So some religious leaders are very active in that space, others perhaps are less so, but it means that there's an opening space for senior religious leaders, but also young people who have come out of that background. There's very little in which religion isn't a factor, but it's not all simply religious. And it does seem to be a fair degree of openness to accommodating different religious traditions in a respectful way. Even traditions that are sort of not historically close. So you may have a Buddhist. One village there was a Buddhist community nearby. But there had been improved relations with largely Chinese Buddhist community and their community, including in village leadership structures and so on.
Yeah, and a lot of them were really proud of that fact and saw their village as like being more harmonious than others, and kind of like they were winning in the big village competition, and particularly that one near the end in the hills by Guster's grave or his ancestors' grave.
Right,
yeah, like they were really talking about how they see themselves as being, you know, one of the most harmonious villages in the area, and wearing that kind of like as a badge of honour type thing. Yeah. That all?
So you're flying to Jakarta in a couple of days.
Yeah, Jogja,
and then you're going to Jogja in Central Java, and then you're going to Malang in East Java.
Yeah.
And so in Malang you'll see some new peace villages that you've not been to before.
Yeah, which would be good to see how different it is across Java. Yeah, and I think I'm not sure how many I'm going to that I've already been to, but I think the majority will be new. So I'm going to 10 villages again, so probably talk to a similar number of people, which is a good amount. Yeah, get some good different perspectives. But I'm keen to ask them some more kind of maybe tricky questions this time as well. So.
I was just going to ask about what kind of response you've got to your evaluation so far, because I know sometimes it can be quite contested. So how's the process worked? You've fed back your interim kind of findings, and yes, how's that process working?
Yeah, so we've only sent it back to like the leaders at Wahid Foundation so far to get checked. So it hasn't gone out, hasn't been disseminated further at this point, but they were really happy with it so far. So Greg's just going to add a little bit more context to the start, because I didn't do that because I thought, well, they already know the context, so we don't need to put it in. But then they were talking about that they want it to be publicly facing. So then it makes sense that it needs like a bit more context in there. But they were really happy with all like the suggestions for consideration or recommendations, and everything that we found. They were quite pleased because it aligned so well with what they were hoping to achieve which is good. But so we've set this up as the report, but then also Kira helped me amazingly with doing some posters. So we've got some posters for the community, which is one's in English and then the other one's in Indonesian. So we'll be able to share them with each village who participated as well. It just gives like an overarching overview. Yeah, so I'll put some to the picture. The picture fell off. Yeah, anyway, there's a picture there too. And so that's in Indonesian, the other version. So they'll probably put them up in the village somewhere, no doubt, just to give them an overview of what we found. Yeah.
And hopefully over the next couple of years we can get more into this process. So this was an initial, I mean, it was the first time Anthony had ever been to Indonesia, I think, Vicky.
Well,
You'd been a couple of times, but still new territory for you too.
New villages for sure.
So yeah, we sort of want to, we are conscious of the fact that we turn up, it takes a lot of time and resources for them. And we don't just want to turn up expecting them to make that available to us without offering anything in return. The question is, what can we use for the offer in return? Well, we don't want to, tell them a bunch of stuff they've worked out for themselves as if they didn't know, but it can be useful to have some outside group come in and articulate things in a way which they either haven't done or just reinforces what they are doing. So that's our thinking about this evaluation.
And that this was across the 10 of the villages as well. So some of them, there was a lot of ideas that were different in different villages that maybe they'll be useful for sharing what people are doing in the different villages as well. So hopefully that's useful.
This is sort of the beginning of the process. So.
Last question.
Yes.
So I noticed that the Wahid Foundation had this organized with UN Women. Was there any recognition of these two different entities when you were interviewing within the villages, or did they just see it as a monolith that's supporting the program?
I think UN Women hasn't been too involved with it rather than as like a funder or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So UN Women is on that Peace Gate. It said UN Women on it. It's on they've got their logo on quite a few stuff. But in terms of them being more involved with any of the sort of implementation, they're not really. So I know that some UN Women staff were going around and meeting some of the different villages, which they hadn't done previously because of COVID, I think. But yeah, they're very kind of more to the side. So it's a Wahid Foundation program. Yeah.